The water is quiet this morning, too quiet. The surface barely moves except for the slow sway of something caught in the reeds. A fisherman stands still, the end of his line dipping into the damp mist wrapping Rhodes Pond like a second skin. He squints, then steps back. Whatever is floating there doesn't belong in this place. Within minutes, the peace of the shoreline fractures. Patrol cars roll in, tires crunching gravel, their lights spinning silently in the early fog. Officers lift yellow tape, stringing it across branches as boots press into the muddy edge of the water. One deputy radios for backup, his voice steady, trained, but behind the tone there is something else. A tremor. A hesitation. A recognition that what they've found cannot be undone. Because lying half-submerged beneath the morning haze is a torso. No limbs. No name. No answers. One officer steps closer, his breath unsteady. "This wasn't supposed to happen here," he mutters, the words slipping out before he can stop them. But whispers begin almost instantly. Officers exchange glances. Phones vibrate. Someone mentions a name, a quiet, uneasy hum spreading across the scene. A missing Green Beret. A man who vanished without a trace. A man the county has been looking for weeks. Clint Bonnell. Suddenly the flashes come fast, like memory fragments breaking through a nightmare. A welfare check at his home. His car still in the driveway, untouched. His backpack still sitting near his desk. His wife standing in the doorway giving a statement in a controlled, even tone. Detectives exchanging a glance, something in the house, something in her words, not adding up. And then, the negation, the truth that contradicts everything the public first believed. People believed Clint simply walked away, but he didn't walk anywhere. The camera pulls back. The morning light brightens. The torso is lifted from the water. And as investigators place the evidence markers into the mud, one final breath of silence falls over the pond, as if the world itself is holding still, waiting for the truth to surface. When the news first broke, it didn't sound like the beginning of a tragedy. It sounded like confusion, like a man who might have stepped away to clear his head, or someone buried under the weight of a demanding schedule. A respected retired Green Beret, disciplined, structured, dependable, simply failed to show up. That alone felt strange. But no one imagined what would come next. Clint Bonnell wasn't just another missing person. He was a decorated veteran, a man who had served his country in some of the most intense environments on the planet. After 2 decades in the military, he had reinvented himself, chasing a new purpose in the medical field. He was enrolled in a competitive physician assistant program, known for its intensity, grueling exams, and unforgiving schedule. Yet even under that pressure, Clint was the kind of student who still checked in on classmates, shared notes, and showed up early to every lab. So when he didn't come home, when messages went unanswered, when he stopped showing up to class, people noticed immediately. Friends reached out. Professors grew concerned. Family members felt the familiar twist of dread settling in their stomachs. Something was wrong, something deeper than stress or exhaustion. And then the questions began spreading across the small community around Campbell University. Where was Clint? Why would a man known for his precision suddenly vanish? Why was his car still in the driveway, untouched? Why were his belongings in their usual places, neatly arranged, ready for another day that never came? At first, the story traveled quietly. Local whispers, campus conversations, concerned messages shared among military friends. But everything changed the moment the gruesome discovery at Rhodes Pond hit the news. A torso, partially decomposed, recovered from still water. No name attached yet, but everyone felt the chill of possibility gathering around them. And then the confirmation came. It was Clint. The story exploded. National outlets picked it up. Military communities across the country reacted with shock and heartbreak. A man who survived deployments, war zones, and the harshest environments the world could offer, was taken not by an enemy overseas, but by something much closer. Something personal. And when authorities finally made an arrest, when the person in handcuffs turned out to be someone who once shared his home, his meals, his dreams, the nation couldn't look away. This wasn't just a case. It was a collision of themes that cut deep into the human experience. Marital strain that simmered beneath the surface. Secrets that grew heavy in the quiet corners of a home. A battle for control, unseen by friends, hidden behind closed doors. The struggle for identity after military retirement, a transition many veterans face but few openly discuss. A life that appeared steady, until the moment everything cracked. This documentary will explore not just the crime but the lives behind it. The choices, the pressures, the unraveling threads. It will honor Clint, his service, his humanity, his pursuit of a new purpose. And it will trace the events that led to one of the most unsettling crimes to emerge from this quiet part of North Carolina. This is the story of a disappearance that shook a community, a marriage that fractured in silence, and a tragedy that no one saw coming. To understand the weight of this case, its heartbreak, its shock, its unraveling, we first have to understand who Clint Bonnell was before the headlines, before the investigation, before Rhodes Pond became the center of an unthinkable discovery. Because Clint's story didn't begin with tragedy. It began with discipline, loyalty, and a quiet determination that shaped the entire course of his life. Clint grew up in a household where hard work wasn't optional, it was expected. As a child, he wasn't the loudest in the room. He wasn't the class clown or the troublemaker. He was the kid who paid attention, who listened, who learned. While other children were restless, Clint was focused. There was a steadiness to him even then, a calm presence that would later become one of his defining traits. His parents often described him as responsible beyond his years. If he said he would do something, he did it. No excuses. No shortcuts. Friends remember him as the boy who looked after others, making sure no one was left behind during games, checking on kids who were nervous before school tests, stepping in quietly whenever someone needed help. His family wasn't wealthy, but they were tight-knit. The Bonnells believed in two things: integrity and accountability. Clint absorbed both. His father impressed the importance of standing by your word. His mother taught him compassion, the kind that isn't loud or dramatic but shown in small, meaningful gestures. These values became part of him, woven into the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, and ultimately, the way he served. Clint wasn't the type of young man who drifted through life waiting for direction. He chased it. He sought purpose. From an early age, he admired stories of service. Military heroes, rescue teams, men who dedicated their lives to something larger than themselves. He looked at discipline not as restriction but as structure, a kind of freedom born from order. Teachers noticed his commitment. Coaches relied on him. The pattern of his life was already forming: quiet strength, unwavering loyalty, and a determination to build himself into someone dependable. For Clint, service wasn't just a profession. It was a calling. Loyalty was not conditional, it was absolute. Responsibility was more than a task, it was a way of existing in the world. These beliefs would lead him straight into one of the hardest, most demanding careers imaginable, and he would give himself to it completely. Clint entered the military at a young age, driven by purpose and a desire to be part of something meaningful. The path to becoming a Green Beret is one of the most grueling, selective, and unforgiving training pipelines in the world. Only a fraction make it through. Clint made it. He pushed his body, his mind, and his resilience to the limits, surviving selection, advanced tactical training, survival courses, and leadership evaluations. His deployments would take him across the world, placing him in environments where every decision mattered and every moment required clarity, courage, and precision. He didn't boast about his service. He didn't tell war stories at dinner or brag about his accomplishments. Like many soldiers of his caliber, what he did overseas stayed overseas. Clint earned the respect of his superiors. He earned commendations for leadership, performance under pressure, and his ability to remain calm in environments that tested every human instinct. Those who served beside him described him as reliable, unshakable, and the one you wanted next to you when things went wrong. His brothers in arms would later say Clint had a natural command, not loud, not aggressive, but grounded. When others panicked, he strategized. When others froze, he moved. He carried the weight of responsibility with quiet pride, never asking for recognition. Clint led by example. He didn't shout orders, he modeled them. He believed that true leadership wasn't about authority, it was about trust. And trust, in his eyes, was something earned slowly, through consistency and character. But years of service take a toll. The long deployments, the separations, the constant vigilance, they shape a person. Clint wasn't broken, but he was changed. Like many veterans, he carried invisible weight. He had seen the best and worst of humanity, and he returned home with a mind sharpened by duty but shadowed by exhaustion. After more than 2 decades in uniform, stepping away was harder than it looked. Retirement wasn't a release, it was a void. The structure that once defined his days was replaced by uncertainty. Many veterans described this as losing a piece of themselves. Clint felt some of that too. Not publicly, not loudly, but deeply. He needed a new mission, a new identity, a new purpose. Clint's next chapter wasn't an accident, it was a choice grounded in who he had always been. Service was in his DNA, and medicine offered a new way to help others, to protect life instead of confronting death. He researched programs, prerequisites, shadowing opportunities. He approached this new career path with the same discipline he applied to the military. When he was accepted into a competitive physician assistant program, it felt like the beginning of something. A chance to rebuild. A chance to grow. Classmates noticed his work ethic immediately: early mornings, late nights, relentless study habits. He wasn't there for prestige. He was there to earn the knowledge, to do the work, to eventually treat real patients who needed him. Clint was the kind of student who stayed after lab sessions to help clean up equipment. The one who stayed awake studying until his eyes hurt. The one who helped classmates who were falling behind. He wasn't loud about it, he simply stepped in quietly, offering support the way he always had. The workload was intense. Dense anatomy courses, fast-paced clinical training, endless exams. But Clint handled it the way he handled everything, head-on. His classmates respected him not just for his military background, but for his humility. He asked questions. He listened. He wanted to get it right. He also formed a close bond with one particular classmate, a relationship that would later become a major part of the case's emotional landscape. Clint envisioned a future where he could blend everything he knew about discipline and service into a new chapter of healing. Emergency medicine, trauma care, primary care, he was exploring it all. He saw a long-term career, one that would let him give back to his community the way he once gave to his country. But behind the strong exterior, Clint was carrying more than books and lab equipment. The transition from military life to civilian life weighed on him. So did the pressure of academic excellence. And at home, tension was growing, slowly, quietly, persistently. These pressures didn't break him, but they shaped the choices he would make in the months before his death. To the people who knew him personally, Clint wasn't just a soldier or a student. He was a husband, a friend, someone who tried to be steady even when life became complicated. Most described him as gentle, reserved, the kind of man who listened before he spoke. He wasn't explosive or unpredictable. He tried to solve problems quietly, rationally. He didn't like conflict. He avoided yelling, avoided escalation, avoided emotional chaos. When something hurt him, he internalized it. When something frustrated him, he tried to work through it privately. He was direct in matters of responsibility, but hesitant in matters of emotional confrontation. He believed in duty, in structure, but less in explaining his personal needs. That combination made him reliable, but also vulnerable in moments where honesty conflicted with peace. By the time he entered the PA program, Clint was searching, not for recognition but for renewal. He wanted stability. He wanted purpose. He wanted a future that matched the years he had given in service. His life was shifting, growing, changing. And with that change came tension, friction, and the quiet emergence of choices that would eventually collide with tragedy. Before this case became a headline, before investigators began combing through timelines, interviews, and digital trails, there was a woman named Shauna Cloud. And like every person who finds themselves at the center of a story no one expected, her life did not begin in a courtroom or in the pages of police reports. It began in ordinary places, shaped by experiences that would follow her for decades. Shauna grew up in the kind of environment that many would describe as structured on the outside, but complex beneath the surface. Her childhood was marked by a blend of expectations, quiet, subtle demands about how she should present herself, how she should behave, who she should become. In many ways, she learned early to adapt, to manage emotions quietly, and to carry herself in ways that wouldn't disrupt the picture others expected of her. People who knew her as a child often mentioned she was sensitive, observant, someone who wanted to be liked and accepted. But with that came a deep undercurrent of insecurity, the kind that doesn't scream but whispers. The kind that slowly teaches a child to pay attention to shifts in tone, to fear disappointing others, to work a little harder to maintain stability. It wasn't chaos that shaped her early years, it was the pressure of appearing stable, even when she didn't always feel that way inside. As she grew older, those early patterns followed her. She became someone who wanted connection but often feared losing it. Someone who valued closeness but worried about change. And whether she realized it or not, those internal patterns would come to influence every major decision in her adult life. Long before Shauna met Clint, she had already lived through relationships that gave shape to her understanding of partnership, loyalty, and conflict. People close to her later shared that she had a history of relationships marked by intensity, periods of closeness, followed by periods of emotional distance or strain. Her desire for stability often clashed with a fear that stability was fragile, that it could disappear if she didn't hold on tightly enough. Her work history reflected the same push and pull, moments of ambition followed by moments of uncertainty. She tried to build a predictable life, but life does not always cooperate with rigid expectations. Money stress, shifting priorities, and personal challenges played roles throughout the years. And as pressures built, Shauna increasingly sought predictability, someone to anchor her. She wasn't someone who craved power in a grand sense. What she craved was security, the feeling that nothing in her world would suddenly fall apart. But the intense need for security, paired with the fear of losing it, can create its own gravity, a pull that begins shaping how a person responds to stress, conflict, and change. People who knew her described her not as outwardly controlling, but as someone who felt deeply unsettled when circumstances shifted beyond her control. When relationships felt uncertain, when finances were strained, when life felt unpredictable, those were the moments when her anxiety and fear became harder to hide. Shauna met Clint during a period when she was searching for steadiness, and Clint, disciplined, reliable, structured, seemed to offer exactly that. He was the kind of man whose routine was built on decades of military service, the kind of man who moved with purpose, who communicated with clarity. Their connection in the early days felt natural, almost effortless. They complemented one another in the way many couples do. He brought structure, she brought emotional openness. Friends would later recall that Shauna admired Clint's discipline, his sense of responsibility, his ability to provide direction. And Clint likely appreciated her social warmth, her desire to build a home, her wish for partnership. But even early on, there were differences not in love, but in how each of them processed conflict and stress. Clint, shaped by years of military structure, tended to internalize frustration rather than escalate it. He followed procedures, routines, timelines. Shauna, conversely, was more emotionally reactive, more sensitive to shifts in tone, to changes in attention, to the subtle cues that made her worry something was wrong. Their differences didn't clash immediately. In fact, they balanced each other for a time. But beneath the surface, those differences created quiet fractures. As Clint pursued the next chapter of his life, the transition from soldier to student in a highly demanding physician assistant program, Shauna felt the shift immediately. His schedule tightened. His focus intensified. His energy narrowed towards studying, tests, rotations, group work, and the pressure cooker of academic life. For many couples, transitions like these create adjustments. For Shauna, who feared changes she couldn't control, the adjustment was harder. She began sensing distance where Clint simply felt stress. She interpreted his quietness as withdrawal, where he saw it as concentration. She feared losing her place in his world just as he was trying to build a new one. And then came what investigators would later refer to as one of the central stress points in the marriage, the alleged extramarital relationship. Whether fueled by fact, misunderstanding, or insecurity, it became a catalyst, a growing tension that amplified everything else. Shauna began feeling a mix of fear, jealousy, frustration, and desperation. Clint, meanwhile, withdrew further into his academic environment, not fully recognizing the emotional weight building at home. By the time Clint was deep into his PA program, the marriage was carrying a weight neither fully understood. Clint was reinventing his purpose after 2 decades in uniform. That kind of transition is enormous. A shift from identity through service to identity through education and healing. For Shauna, that shift felt like losing the version of Clint she once relied on. Her psychological stressors began stacking. The fear that Clint's new world didn't include her in the same way, the fear of abandonment, the pressure of finances and household responsibility, emotional insecurity tied to past relationships, the perceived threat of someone else capturing his attention, the possibility of Clint outgrowing her as he built a new future. What Shauna wanted most was reassurance. What Clint needed most was space to focus on his demanding academic path. But their needs never aligned, not fully. The more Clint withdrew into schoolwork, the more Shauna's anxiety grew. The more her anxiety grew, the more Clint felt overwhelmed. It became a feedback loop neither could easily break. Friends later noticed signs: tension in phone calls, short arguments, inconsistencies in their communication. And behind closed doors, Shauna's internal fears began clashing with the reality she believed she was losing control of. Her world felt unstable, and she responded not with calm negotiation, but with escalating emotion. And that brings us to a crucial negation, one that frames how this story will continue. To the outside world, Shauna seemed calm, but calm can hide a storm. It's not about dramatizing her life or vilifying her character. It's about understanding the psychological pressure points that built over time. Because no moment in this case emerged from nowhere, There were signs, shifts, and stresses that accumulated until something irreversible occurred. Every relationship has moments of tension, quiet disagreements, missed signals, and emotional drift. But in the story of Clint Bonnell and Shauna Cloud, these moments didn't dissolve on their own. Instead, they stacked, layer by layer, forming a timeline that would later become one of the most scrutinized pieces of the investigation. A timeline showing exactly how a marriage once rooted in stability began to unravel from the inside. In the months leading up to Clint's disappearance, those closest to him noticed small, almost imperceptible shifts. Tiny fractures in the way he carried himself, in the tone of his messages, in the weight behind his words. To friends in his PA program, Clint seemed exhausted, but not only from academics. There was a different kind of fatigue in his voice, the kind born from tension at home. He mentioned arguments, quiet ones, sharp ones, the kind that erupted suddenly over things that didn't feel important. These weren't arguments about love or betrayal in the dramatic sense. They were about pressure, time, and emotional needs they no longer met for one another. At some point, the arguments became patterns. The patterns became distance. And the distance became a kind of emotional separation that no longer existed only in their heads. It became visible. Clint began spending more time at school, staying later, taking extra hours for studying. On paper, the PA program was an easy explanation. Students routinely immersed themselves in labs, clinical prep, and study groups. But for Clint, it gradually became more than academics. It became a refuge. A space where the air was not charged with tension. Shauna noticed the shift immediately. And what she sensed wasn't just distance. It was loss of influence over the person she built a life with. She felt him slipping out of the orbit she'd relied on for years, and that fear, quiet at first, grew louder inside her. The turning point came when Clint accepted what he had tried to avoid for months. The marriage was no longer sustainable. Not emotionally, not mentally, not for the person he wanted to become. He began quietly exploring the process of separation. He confided in close friends that he needed clarity, that he couldn't keep trying to fix something that wasn't healing. And so, privately, carefully, he took the step that would define everything that came after. Clint contacted a divorce lawyer. This wasn't a decision born of anger. It wasn't made suddenly. It was made through exhaustion, the kind that sets in when someone realizes they've tried everything they can, and still feel themselves sinking. When Shauna sensed the shift, it hit her deeply. She had already feared it, now she felt it crystallizing into reality. Her emotional responses grew sharper. Conversations escalated more quickly. The anxiety she carried since childhood, the fear of change, the fear of abandonment, surged. To her, Clint's emotional distance wasn't just stress. It felt like a threat, like an unraveling of the stability she had built her life around. And when she became aware of Clint's connection with another woman, someone who understood him, someone he trusted, her fear sharpened into a kind of panic. Investigators would later call it a moment of psychological crisis, a tipping point. From the outside, people saw two completely different stories. Clint's classmates described him as more focused, more determined, more ready to take ownership of the next chapter in his life. They said he smiled more at school than he did at home. They said he looked relieved when he talked about finally taking control of his emotional well-being. Friends and relatives described Shauna as emotional, anxious, and increasingly fragile. They said she seemed afraid of being left behind, afraid of her marriage disappearing piece by piece. But she didn't show this publicly. Not in her voice, not in her posture. She kept a calm exterior, even as that calm began to crack beneath the surface. In Clint's final days, his messages carried a tone that investigators described as conflicted but hopeful. He was honest about the tension at home. He was honest about wanting peace, clarity, and the possibility of a future built on stability and kindness. In one message, he described feeling done with the arguing. In another, he hinted that he needed a fresh start. The words weren't dramatic. They weren't exaggerated. They were measured, the voice of a man who felt worn down and ready to step into something healthier. Those texts would later become crucial elements of the investigation, not because of what they revealed about Clint's emotions, but because of what they revealed about the timing. Clint was preparing to separate. He was preparing to leave. And Shauna knew it. What makes the unraveling so haunting is this. To the outside world, Shauna looked composed. She smiled. She carried herself calmly. She seemed functional, even cooperative. But inside she was breaking. This is what psychologists call attachment panic. A visceral reaction triggered when someone believes the person they rely on emotionally is about to leave. It doesn't look dramatic on the outside. It doesn't always look frantic. Sometimes it looks like silence, stillness, calm. A calm that hides a storm. And as detectives would later piece together the timeline, they realized that the most dangerous point in the unraveling wasn't the arguments. It wasn't the distance. It wasn't even the decision to divorce. It was the moment Shauna recognized that she no longer had control over what happened next. The final 24 hours of Clint Bonnell's life did not begin with chaos. They began with routine, the kind of ordinary day that hides its significance until you examine every minute, every message, every sudden silence. What investigators would later piece together was not a story of a man who vanished suddenly, but a day filled with subtle signals, moments that made sense only in hindsight. A day that revealed an emotional storm building quietly in the shadows of a home that looked calm from the outside. On the morning before everything changed, Clint arrived on campus early as he often did. He greeted classmates with a tired smile. He sat in the same spot in the lab. He reviewed notes for an upcoming exam. Nothing about him seemed fearful. Nothing seemed rushed. If anything, he appeared focused, and lighter than he had been in weeks. But underneath that focus, there was finality. Classmates later recalled a subtle shift in him. He seemed relieved, as if a burden had been lifted. He spoke about future rotations, about clinical placements, about getting through the hardest part of the program. And in every conversation, there was a sense that he was looking forward, not back. Throughout the day, Clint exchanged several texts. With his girlfriend, with friends, with classmates. The tone was steady, warm, open. His messages showed plans, intention, life. In his final text to his girlfriend, Clint sounded hopeful, discussing the next steps of rebuilding his life, free from conflict. He mentioned that he might be later than usual getting home, but he didn't sound worried. He didn't sound afraid. What investigators would later focus on were not the messages he sent, but the silence that followed. A silence that began shortly after he left campus. Clint's phone location tracked his drive home. A familiar route. A straight path. Nothing unusual. No detours. No stops. Just a man heading back to a house that had become emotionally heavy, but still predictable. Then, his location signal stopped. Not miles away. Not in the woods. Not near a store. It stopped exactly where investigators feared it would. At the home he shared with Shauna. Neighbors reported nothing unusual. No loud sounds. No shouting. No signs of a struggle. The house appeared quiet, curtains drawn, lights off earlier than usual. What happened inside that silence is known only through forensic evidence, and the contradictions that would later unravel in Shauna's shifting story. This wasn't a disappearance into the night. This wasn't a man who walked away. This was something far more deliberate, unfolding behind closed doors. Shauna's initial statement was simple. She claimed Clint came home, that they talked briefly, that nothing seemed out of the ordinary. She said he left again, walking, driving, or simply stepping out for air. She wasn't clear. She said she assumed he'd be back. But assumed quickly became the anchor of her story, a word that investigators found troubling. Because nothing else in her statement matched the timeline. At first, Shauna said Clint left willingly. Later she said he seemed stressed. Later still, she added details that didn't appear in her original statement. And detectives noticed something. Shauna's story changed whenever new information was presented to her. When questioned about Clint's car, still in the driveway, her explanation shifted. When asked about his missing phone, her explanation shifted again. When confronted with timeline inconsistencies, she altered details once more. But the biggest contradiction came from something she never expected investigators to check so thoroughly: her phone activity. Phone records showed a different story. One in which Shauna was awake far longer than she admitted, active online during hours she claimed to be asleep, and moving through the house in patterns inconsistent with her original timeline. There were unanswered calls, sudden deletions, unexplained gaps, activity that investigators described as unusual at best, concealed at worst. And then there was the moment that changed the direction of the investigation entirely, the period when Clint's phone stopped responding, but Shauna's phone showed movement, screenshots, and searches inconsistent with her story. Investigators often say that crimes like these don't begin with violence. They begin long before. In moments of resentment. In quiet fears. In spiraling thoughts that no one else can hear. And in this case, the disappearance didn't happen suddenly. It wasn't random. It wasn't unexpected. It wasn't a moment of spontaneous chaos. This wasn't a sudden disappearance. It was the end of a long, invisible countdown. A countdown that only one person knew had reached zero. When the first welfare check request came in, It didn't immediately raise alarms. People go off the grid. Students get overwhelmed. Adults sometimes just need space. But when the dispatcher mentioned the name Clint Bonnell, the responding deputies paused for a split second. A retired Green Beret going silent? That wasn't something they encountered every day. The deputies pulled up to the house expecting to do a quick knock, take a report and move on. Instead, they stepped into something that felt frozen. Clint's vehicle sat in the driveway, clean, undisturbed, exactly where it always was. That alone didn't prove anything, but what came next did. Deputies approached the front door. No response. They circled the property. The stillness around the house wasn't peaceful. It was unnatural. A house can carry energy when someone is inside, moving, living, breathing. This one felt empty. Inside, they found Clint's backpack placed neatly on a table near the entrance. Inside were the things he carried everywhere. Notebooks from his physician assistant program, study materials, pens, small reminders of the new life he was trying to build. Students don't leave backpacks behind. Not voluntarily. His keys were placed next to a charging cable. His personal items, wallet, watch, daily accessories, sat untouched, positioned in a way that suggested routine, normalcy, continuity. But the air inside told a different story. Nothing appeared broken, but nothing felt right. The deputies walked carefully through each room, calling his name out of procedural habit. Silence answered back. Everywhere they looked, there was this eerie sense that Clint had intended to return. Everything was paused, as if time inside the house had stopped the moment he stepped beyond its walls. Except, maybe he never did. One deputy later wrote in his notes, "House clean. Ordered. Too ordered. Something off." When deputies contacted Shauna Cloud, Clint's wife, she answered the door with an expression that officers later struggled to describe. Not distressed. Not relieved. Somewhere in between, like she was performing a role she wasn't fully prepared for. She repeated the same story. Clint had left home. He was stressed. Disconnected. Maybe he needed space. Her tone was soft but strangely rehearsed, as if she'd practiced it. She gave details, small, specific ones, but they held no weight, like puzzle pieces from the wrong box. Detectives observed her posture, her gaze, her shifting answers to simple questions. When asked when she last saw him, her timeline shifted by hours. When asked if they'd argued, her answer changed depending on how the question was phrased. She seemed calm. Too calm. Detectives didn't interrupt her, didn't confront her. They simply noted every inconsistency, every subtle crack forming in the portrait she was painting. One detective later recounts, she had the tone of someone trying to sound shocked, without actually being shocked. Friends, classmates, and co-workers were interviewed next. Their reactions were sharp contrast. They were worried, confused. Some were openly emotional. Clint wasn't someone who disappeared. Not without contacting someone. Not without a trace. He's responsible. He's disciplined. If he was struggling, he would have told someone, anyone. Text message logs were requested. Phone records began to be pulled. Interviews expanded to neighbors. One neighbor commented, "He was here. He was always here. Something's wrong." Detectives didn't say the words out loud yet, but they were thinking them. By the time Clint had been missing for 24 hours, the case was no longer treated as a simple welfare concern. A full search effort launched across multiple counties. Volunteers gathered, fellow PA students, former military friends, neighbors, instructors. They fanned out across wooded areas, walking trails, waterways. They weren't searching for a man who wanted to disappear. They were searching for a man who couldn't come home. Drones scanned tree lines and backroads. K-9 units tracked scents leading nowhere definitive. Search teams revisited Clint's last known movements, his class schedule, the security footage on campus, the route he normally drove. Digital forensics became the key focus. Clint's phone had gone silent. Not powered off, silent. No pings. No movement. A void where data should be. Detectives reviewed timestamps from home devices, analyzed location records, compared surveillance videos, and began mapping a timeline that simply didn't match Shauna's statements. Background checks on everyone involved began. Deep dives into relationships, marital dynamics, text logs, and financial records revealed tension that wasn't initially visible. Cases don't start with answers. They start with cracks. And the cracks in this story were widening fast. As more people were interviewed, a pattern emerged. Clint was preparing for change, major change. He had dreams, plans, and difficult decisions he was gearing up to make, including leaving the marriage. What detectives didn't know yet was just how close those decisions were to being finalized, and how deeply someone else feared them. The search effort continued into the night, flashlights in the woods, reflective vests glowing in darkness, volunteers calling his name into empty air. Every hour that passed without a sign of Clint whispered the same chilling truth. This was no longer a missing person case. It was something darker. Rhodes Pond is the kind of place people go to think. Quiet water, slow mornings, reeds brushing softly in the wind. For the fishermen who arrived just after sunrise, it was supposed to be a simple routine. Cast a line, breathe, clear the mind before work. But the moment he stepped onto the dock, he froze. Something wasn't right. About 20 yards out, near the reeds, the water moved in a way that made him uneasy. Not like a fish breaking the surface. Not like driftwood rolling with the tide. This movement was heavier. Uneven. Wrong. He squinted, trying to understand what he was seeing. Then the object turned slightly in the water, and he understood instantly, this wasn't debris. It looked human. His hands shook as he reached for his phone. The call came in at 7:42 a.m. His voice stumbled as he explained the situation, the words catching in his throat. He kept watching the water as he waited for deputies to arrive, unable to look away. There are discoveries the mind cannot unsee, and this was one of them. He stepped back from the shoreline as if distance could somehow undo what he'd just witnessed. Within minutes, patrol vehicles rolled up, followed by detectives. The quiet morning turned into a controlled emergency scene. Sirens off, urgency high, tension sharp. Deputies walked to the water's edge. Even from a distance, they knew this was no accident. No drowning. No missing person case gone wrong. There was violence here, violence someone tried desperately to hide. When the dive team arrived, their approach was silent and methodical. They'd done recoveries before, but this one carried a different weight. Something about the deputies' faces told them this wasn't just another call. The divers slipped into the water, moving slowly toward the object. Crowds hadn't gathered yet, just a few early joggers who stopped with startled expressions as they realized something terrible had happened. The recovery was careful, deliberate. The body, or what was left of it, was fragile, damaged beyond what nature could do in such a short time. The remains were a torso. No limbs. Evidence of multiple gunshot wounds. A deliberate attempt to erase identity. But violence always leaves traces. Deputies watched as the body was brought to shore, wrapped, and placed on a stretcher. No one spoke. Even seasoned investigators felt the weight of it. Preliminary observations suggested the victim had been shot more than once. The marks were unmistakable. This wasn't disposal, it was mutilation. A desperate attempt to ensure the victim would never be recognized. Someone wanted this man to disappear, not just from the world but from memory. The autopsy would later confirm difficult truths. The torso bore entry wounds consistent with multiple gunshots. The precision of the dismemberment suggested intent, not impulse. This was personal, emotional, intimate violence. But identifying the victim would take time. With no limbs, no fingerprints, and no intact clothing, investigators were forced to rely on other clues. Scar tissue, bullet trajectory, ballistic fragments, and eventually DNA. Even then, the detectives on scene already feared the answer. They'd been searching for a missing military veteran, a man with discipline, routine, and a tight-knit network of classmates and friends. A man who vanished without reason. They didn't want it to be Clint. But they already knew. News spreads differently in small towns. Faster. Sharper. It travels through gas stations, classrooms, diners, group chats, and neighborhood porches. Within hours of the recovery at Rhodes Pond, communities across North Carolina were buzzing with fear and disbelief. At first, people didn't connect the discovery to the missing person report involving retired Green Beret Clint Bonnell. But as law enforcement expanded, the search perimeter and silence from officials grew heavier, speculation turned into dread. Friends from Clint's PA program began messaging each other in panic. This can't be him, right? Please tell me it isn't Clint. There's no way. He wouldn't end up there. He wouldn't. Neighbors who knew him struggled to process the idea. Clint was stable, disciplined, focused. He had survived deployment after deployment, some of the most intense environments on Earth. To imagine that his life could end violently back home was unthinkable. In the neighborhood surrounding Rhodes Pond, families who had planned calm morning routines found themselves peering through windows at police activity, hugging their children a little closer. The idea that someone could commit such brutality nearby shook people deeply. Across social media, concern grew rapidly. Posts described Clint as kind, intelligent, hardworking. someone who lifted others up, the kind of person who made people feel safe. That's what made the discovery so painful. Because if someone like Clint wasn't safe, who was? Locals expressed shock, then anger. How could something like this happen here? How could someone go missing and within days be found like that? Who would do something so extreme? And the unspoken question beneath them all: what kind of hatred, or fear, drives a person to erase another with such violence? Detectives felt the pressure mounting. The community wanted answers. The family wanted answers. Classmates, neighbors, and friends wanted clarity, justice, closure. Everyone waited. And behind the scenes, investigators were quietly preparing to confront the unimaginable truth. This wasn't a stranger's attack. This wasn't random. This was rooted in a home, a relationship, a fracture that had widened until it broke. Once the remains from Rhodes Pond arrived at the medical examiner's office, the investigation shifted into its most critical phase: identification. Detectives hoped, desperately, that the torso recovered was not Clint Bonnell. Hope, however, can only exist until the evidence speaks. The medical examiner's team began with what little remained. Clothing fibers were too degraded to be useful. Bullet wounds provided trajectory clues but no identity. The dismemberment eliminated fingerprints, and decomposition limited certain forensic avenues. But DNA always tells the truth. A bone sample was extracted and processed. The lab worked quickly, understanding the urgency. Clint's toothbrush, razor, and personal items were collected from his home to provide a comparison profile. When the results returned, there was no ambiguity. The torso belonged to Clint Bonnell. The missing Green Beret was no longer missing. Detectives paused when they heard the confirmation. Not dramatically. Not theatrically. Just a subtle inhale, sharp, painful, heavy. The case was no longer a search. It was a homicide. Once identity was confirmed, digital forensics became the backbone of the investigation. Every modern case leaves a trail. Signals, timestamps, pings, the digital fingerprints people forget they're leaving behind. Clint's phone had gone silent around the time he disappeared. But silence in the digital world still leaves data. Detectives requested his historical ping records, and what they saw instantly narrowed their focus. 3 key facts emerged. Clint's phone stopped transmitting inside his own home. It never left the property. The shutdown occurred at a time Shauna later claimed he had already walked out. That discrepancy wasn't small. It was seismic. A phone that never leaves the house cannot belong to a man who supposedly left to clear his mind. Investigators then pulled Shauna's phone data. The pings told a different story, one full of movement at odd hours, trips she never mentioned, and gaps in time where her phone appeared to be in isolated areas near Rhodes Pond. Patterns were forming. Patterns that didn't support her narrative. Surveillance doesn't lie. It doesn't forget. It doesn't adjust its story when asked twice. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, collecting footage from doorbell cameras, street monitors, store parking lots, and traffic lights. Hours of video were reviewed frame by frame, looking for movement around the Bonnell residence during the critical window. They found it. Late at night, long after Clint was supposedly gone, a vehicle matching Shauna's was captured driving toward back roads leading to Rhodes Pond. The timing aligned with travel distance and the estimated disposal window. The footage wasn't incriminating by itself. Not until they paired it with the timeline. Shauna said she was home. Her phone said she wasn't. The cameras confirmed the phone. Then came the most chilling detail. No camera in the area ever captured Clint's vehicle leaving the home. He never drove anywhere. He couldn't have. The next breakthrough came from analyzing tire marks and mileage. Detectives examined Shauna's vehicle closely. Recent mud patterns on the wheel well matched the type of sediment found near Rhodes Pond. The odometer readings suggested unexplained travel. Miles that could not be accounted for by her stated schedule. Inside the trunk, forensic luminol revealed faint traces. Subtle, diluted, but present enough to suggest an attempt at cleaning. Not blood. None was detectable at that point, but chemical residue consistent with bleach and detergents. Someone tried very hard to erase something. And failed. Dismemberment is not impulsive. It requires time, tools, emotional detachment, or emotional collapse. The method suggested planning, not panic. Forensic examiners studied cut marks on bone, determining the type of tool used. The marks were consistent with a household saw. Nothing specialized, nothing surgical. A tool that could be purchased at any hardware store. The disposal wasn't professional. It was desperate. The wounds indicated the victim was shot before dismemberment, meaning the mutilation occurred after death, not before. That detail mattered. It revealed sequence, intent, and the emotional state of whoever did this. Investigators now believed they were dealing with a perpetrator acting alone or with very limited help. Someone improvising, not someone experienced. The brutality was not the work of a stranger. It was rooted in personal emotion. Because the dismemberment required time and privacy, detectives investigated locations tied to Shauna: storage units, rental properties, family-owned spaces. One rental unit in particular raised concern. Inside, investigators found traces of cleaning agents, packaging materials, and a lingering chemical smell. Not enough to file charges yet, but enough to expand the search warrant. "This is where the story cracks," one detective later commented. In the corner of the unit, hidden beneath boxes, they found a single piece of evidence that shattered the investigation open. A blood-stained fabric scrap containing DNA matching Clint. Small, overlooked, but devastating. It proved the crime didn't occur where Shauna claimed. It proved movement. It proved intent. As the investigation widened, more pieces fell into place. Clint's clothing, missing since the day he vanished, was partially recovered, damaged, and stained. Some items were burned, others cut. The condition aligned with the timeline and the disposal effort. Tools found in the home contained microscopic traces linking back to the remains. Chemical residue matched the trunk findings. Digital traces completed the mosaic: search history, deleted text messages, location logs, unsent drafts, panic searches, attempts to erase phone activity. Every piece tightened the circle. But the real breakthrough came from something no one expected. A smart home device, a simple, ordinary, always-on home assistant, recorded audio logs and time-stamped activity that contradicted Shauna's entire story. The device captured the sound of an argument. The moment Clint's phone stopped responding. Footsteps moving rapidly. A sudden thud. Then silence. An hour later, the device logged movement again. Late-night activity in the kitchen and garage at a time Shauna claimed she was asleep. She forgot the device was listening. And it destroyed the timeline she built. The moment detectives reviewed the logs, everything snapped into place. There was no walk. No voluntary disappearance. No leaving to clear his mind. There was only the truth. And the truth pointed directly at Shauna. The interviews with Shauna Tate quickly became a turning point in the investigation. Not because of what she said, but because of how her story kept shifting with every session. When detectives first sat down with Shauna, her demeanor was composed, almost overly calm. She framed herself as someone blindsided by Clint's disappearance, confused, worried, and eager to help. But as questions deepened, her emotional tone fluctuated. Moments of forced sadness. Sudden irritation when timelines were pressed. Long pauses that didn't match the questions. Nervous habits, adjusting clothing, tapping fingers, swallowing hard. Detectives recognized that her reactions weren't lining up with genuine distress. What started as minor inconsistencies grew into significant fractures in her narrative. Times she claimed to be at certain locations didn't match phone data. Descriptions of Clint's last movements shifted. Details she previously insisted she didn't remember suddenly became vivid. Her version of events gradually migrated away from her own involvement and toward the idea that Clint might have enemies. The more she talked, the less her story held together. Shauna repeatedly tried to steer the conversation away from herself. She hinted Clint was dealing with stress, suggested he hung around the wrong people, claimed there were arguments he didn't tell her about. At one point, she even suggested investigators check with his old friends. It was a subtle, indirect attempt to plant alternative suspects, without offering anything investigators could verify. Detectives noted every attempt to pivot. They didn't confront her aggressively. They didn't accuse. They let her talk and talk and talk. The strategy worked. As detectives quietly circled back to earlier statements, her story wavered. New details appeared. Previous claims evaporated. Explanations became defensive rather than informative. The room grew heavier each time her own words boxed her in. "I don't know what you want me to say. I've told you everything. I wasn't even near him that night. If something happened, it wasn't because of me. People misunderstand Clint. He had issues. I just think you're looking at the wrong person." Each quote added another layer of doubt. Investigators documented several recurring behaviors. Answering in past tense when asked about the present. Over-explaining simple questions. Laughing at inappropriate moments. Becoming silent when confronted with data. Sudden emotional spikes when inconsistencies were noted. Glancing toward the door whenever the conversation tightened. To seasoned detectives, these weren't random reactions, they were signals. Signals of someone struggling to maintain a story that wasn't true. While detectives pieced together Clint's final hours, one thread began to clarify the tension at the heart of the tragedy. His relationship with a woman outside his marriage. To those close to Clint, the relationship had been discreet but meaningful. Not scandalous, it was quiet, stabilizing, and full of the kind of hope Clint had been searching for after decades of military service and personal sacrifice. His girlfriend described him as cautious, measured, and protective. He had confided his fears, his ambitions, and his dreams for a future free from the strain of marital conflict. For the investigators, these messages became critical. They weren't just love notes, they were time-stamped records of emotion, vulnerability, and a life Clint was planning to reclaim for himself. Detectives obtained phone records and message histories. The correspondence painted a picture of intimacy, planning, and hope. Late-night texts discussing relocation and future careers. Expressions of longing, relief, and cautious excitement. Hints at the conflict with Shauna, Clint confiding his fear of confrontation. The last communication was particularly haunting. Clint expressed a desire to move forward with clarity and honesty, both for himself and for those he cared about. His words reflected resolution, a plan to rebuild his life without causing harm, without panic. He wasn't running away from anyone, a detective later said. He was moving toward something he wanted, something better. The investigators saw the pattern clearly. Clint had made the mental decision to leave, to divorce, to step into a new chapter. That decision alone set a chain reaction in motion. If Clint had a plan, Shauna had a fear. And it wasn't just fear of divorce or separation, it was a fear of losing control. Investigators pieced together her psychological profile using interviews, witness statements, and behavioral observation. Shauna exhibited signs of what experts call attachment panic. She needed reassurance of her partner's presence. She reacted intensely to the threat of losing stability. She interpreted separation as personal failure or rejection. The investigators saw patterns in her past relationships, in her emotional responses, in her social media activity. Each one underscored a recurring theme. She wasn't just angry. She was terrified of being powerless. The messages between Clint and his girlfriend inadvertently became a mirror of Shauna's deepest fears. Every message of hope for Clint was a trigger for her panic. At this point, investigators understood something crucial. This wasn't jealousy alone, it was about losing control. The killing wasn't the result of mere romantic betrayal. It wasn't a crime of passion driven solely by anger or heartbreak. It was strategic, intimate, and deeply personal. The perpetrator had lost the sense of control over a life that had once seemed secure, predictable, and theirs to shape. Clint's hope, his plan, and his quiet steps toward freedom became the very threat that triggered tragedy. In the mind of the perpetrator, the narrative was simple. If I can't have control over him, no one can. The investigators now understood the psychological landscape of the crime. The motive was clear. Not just fear, not just jealousy, but the need to preserve control at all costs. After weeks of meticulous investigation, detectives had amassed a mountain of evidence. Digital records, surveillance footage, forensic analysis, and witness statements all converged on a singular, undeniable conclusion. The decision was made. Shauna Cloud would be formally charged. It wasn't taken lightly. The evidence met the threshold for first-degree murder, accompanied by charges for concealment of a death. The methodical, personal, and deliberate nature of the crime left no room for doubt. At the sheriff's department, the press briefing was carefully orchestrated. The sheriff spoke with gravity, careful not to sensationalize the crime, but unable to hide the tension in his voice. This is a tragedy that has shocked our entire community. The evidence indicates that Mr. Bonnell's death was not an accident. The perpetrator has been identified and charges have been filed. Our hearts go out to the family and friends during this time. Detectives watched as the announcement was made, knowing that the quiet, invisible work of weeks had finally emerged into the public eye. The arrest wasn't dramatic. There were no chase scenes, no desperate confrontations. Shauna Cloud was taken into custody calmly, escorted from her home by officers who had long observed her subtle emotional shifts. Even then, some of her composure remained. Her lawyers instructed silence. Her face remained neutral. But detectives noted the slight tremor in her hands, the brief flicker in her eyes, acknowledgement, perhaps, of inevitability. This marked the transition from investigation to justice. From missing person to homicide case. From questions to accountability. The news reverberated quickly through the community. Shock was immediate. People struggled to reconcile the quiet suburban life they knew with the brutality that had occurred behind closed doors. Neighbors whispered in stunned disbelief, some recalling casual interactions with the couple, mundane, seemingly normal, that now felt hauntingly ordinary. Military community, fellow veterans and former Green Berets expressed grief and anger. Clint had served his country, disciplined and loyal, and his death at home shattered their sense of safety and trust. Many shared statements on social media, honoring his service and expressing heartbreak. PA classmates. Those who had studied alongside Clint remembered the ambitious student who balanced intense coursework with the hope of a new career. They spoke of his meticulous nature, his kindness, and his quiet determination. In classrooms and study groups, his absence left a palpable void. It was the brutality that struck people hardest. Not only had Clint Bonnell been killed, but the method, deliberate, personal, and premeditated, made the horror tangible. Families who had trusted the calm suburban streets suddenly felt the fragility of daily life. Detectives observed the community's emotional pulse. Vigils were planned. Candles were lit near the pond. Messages of solidarity circulated online and in local news. Yet beneath every act of mourning was a lingering question. How could someone so close, so familiar, commit such an act? The arrest of Shauna Cloud didn't bring closure. It brought confrontation with reality, with grief, with anger, with the unsettling truth that the person responsible for destroying a life had once shared it intimately. In the aftermath, the investigation shifted into court preparation, evidence consolidation, and detailed witness statements. Every digital trace, every forensic clue, and every contradiction in Shauna's story would be used to ensure that justice for Clint Bonnell was achieved. The arrest was more than a procedural milestone. It was a pivot point in a story that had begun with disappearance, moved through mystery, and now faced the harsh light of accountability. The pieces of a complex, tragic puzzle were beginning to align, and the nation watched as the story unfolded. By the time the case reached court, prosecutors had meticulously reconstructed the timeline of Clint Bonnell's final hours. Using surveillance footage, phone pings, and witness statements, investigators traced his movements from the campus, through the home, and toward the location where his body was later found. Every call, every message, every motion became a piece of the story. The prosecution presented these moments chronologically. Late afternoon, Clint's final campus activity, interactions with classmates, subtle signs of planning for separation. Early evening, last verified phone pings inside the residence. Night, Shauna's vehicle movements consistent with disposal activities. Early morning hours, digital traces indicating cleaning, movement, and attempts to cover tracks. The reconstruction was painstaking. It left no room for ambiguity. Clint never voluntarily left the house. Every move aligned with premeditated intent to conceal, and ultimately to kill. Ballistics formed the backbone of the prosecution's argument for premeditation. Autopsy reports confirmed multiple gunshot wounds, each placed with calculated precision. The trajectory of bullets indicated the shooter had control, intent, and a methodical approach. Expert witnesses explained the correlation between bullet placement and intent. Wounds were inflicted to ensure incapacitation and death. The method suggested careful planning, not a momentary lapse in judgment. It wasn't a crime of opportunity, the expert testified. It was executed with purpose, precision, and intent. Blood pattern analysis revealed more than physical trauma. It provided insight into sequence, struggle, and post-mortem movement. Patterns indicated that Clint was incapacitated in one area of the home before dismemberment. Forensic analysis showed cleaning attempts consistent with post-offense concealment. Residue on clothing and tools linked directly to the sequence of events described in phone and surveillance data. The blood spoke where witnesses could not. It revealed a methodical, calculated process, and reinforced the prosecution's theory of premeditation. Phone records became one of the most compelling components of the prosecution's case. Each ping, each deleted message, each draft of a text contributed to a digital mosaic of intent. Clint's last messages reflected his hope, planning, and emotional distance from Shauna. Shauna's phone movements contradicted her statements multiple times. Smart home audio logs captured argument, movement, and suspicious activity during critical time windows. Digital evidence left little room for doubt. It confirmed what detectives had pieced together in the physical world. It told a story of premeditation, concealment, and deception. Prosecution experts provided psychological context to the crime. Forensic psychologists described Shauna's emotional state, attachment panic, and fear of abandonment. They explained how these factors, combined with escalating conflict, could result in the precise, violent measures investigators observed. The crime was not impulsive. It was an emotional response amplified by fear, control, and perceived threat to personal stability. Experts emphasized, the perpetrator meticulously planned, prepared, and executed actions to control outcomes, rather than reacting spontaneously. From the prosecution's perspective, the evidence collectively demonstrated premeditation. Surveillance and phone data showed calculated movements. Ballistics and blood patterns indicated methodical execution. Digital traces revealed attempts to cover and manipulate the narrative. Every action was deliberate, the prosecutor told the jury. This was a plan, a sequence, a decision made and executed, not a momentary lapse. The prosecution framed the crime as the culmination of months of emotional strain, control struggles, and a threatened sense of power. In contrast, the defense initially adopted a strategy of silence or limited response. Shauna's legal team carefully avoided early public statements. No immediate narrative was presented to counter the prosecution. Statements focused on procedural fairness, questioning the interpretation of evidence without asserting innocence. Experts retained by the defense were scheduled for later testimony, focusing on mental health, emotional state, and alleged mitigating circumstances. The strategy suggested a measured, long-term approach. Allow the prosecution to present their narrative fully, then carefully deconstruct elements to create reasonable doubt. Observers noted the courtroom tension. Every piece of evidence presented was meticulously documented, but the defense's silence created a sense of anticipation. The story was not yet fully countered. The filings, exhibits, and expert analyses did more than present facts. They told a story of control, fear, and deliberate action. And in that story, the arc of premeditation became impossible to ignore. The stage was now set for testimony, cross-examination, and the unraveling of the human truths behind a meticulously planned crime. Clint Bonnell's life had been defined by transitions, rigorous military training, deployments, and the eventual shift into civilian life. The end of a 20-year career in the Green Berets didn't come without psychological cost. Adjustment to civilian routine after decades of structured life. The subtle but constant pressure to redefine identity and purpose. Loss of the camaraderie, discipline, and mission-driven focus that had previously shaped him. For Shauna Cloud, the transitions were different but equally destabilizing. The shift from being in a marriage where control felt familiar to one in which her partner was seeking independence triggered profound stress. Attachment panic, a well-documented psychological response to the perceived loss of a key emotional bond, began to emerge. Experts later noted that both Clint and Shauna were navigating life-altering stressors, one seeking freedom and fulfillment, the other clinging to stability at all costs. Marriage, at its core, relies on trust, communication, and mutual respect. For Clint and Shauna, these foundations eroded slowly, imperceptibly at first. Arguments escalating from minor disagreements to significant confrontations. Emotional distance growing alongside physical separation. Shauna's fear of abandonment intensifying as Clint took steps toward divorce. Detectives and psychologists alike highlighted the pattern. As Clint sought independence, Shauna's need for control became the dominating dynamic. Control, the central motif of the case, manifested subtly and overtly. Shauna monitored Clint's movements, digital activity, and social interactions. Attempts to redirect conversations and narratives in police interviews. Subtle manipulation of household routines and schedules. Experts later described this as a classic case of control escalation. When control over someone else's decisions is threatened, emotional, cognitive, and sometimes physical responses intensify. The pattern culminated in the act that would shatter the community. Premeditated, deliberate, and deeply personal. Anger alone cannot explain the violence, but rage fueled the methodology. Experts noted that Shauna's responses combined long-standing frustration, perceived betrayal, and fear into explosive energy. Rage manifests differently in people with attachment panic. It is focused, persistent, and intertwined with fear. The careful dismemberment, disposal, and concealment suggest a channeling of rage into action rather than spontaneous aggression. It was a rage not of immediate confrontation, but of calculated, prolonged, and deeply personal retaliation. The psychological evaluation revealed another component, the fear of losing security. Not just emotional but financial and social. Clint's decision to pursue a new career path threatened perceived stability. Shauna's attachment panic was compounded by practical concerns. household income, reputation, and independence. This fear created a sense of impending loss that became intertwined with perceived betrayal. Experts described it as a perfect storm of emotional and practical threat, where fear and control drove decision-making beyond rational limits. All these forces, trauma, marital collapse, control dynamics, rage, and fear, converged in a crescendo of emotional escalation. Small arguments that once would have ended in compromise became explosive. Emotional reasoning gave way to planned, deliberate actions. The trajectory from panic to premeditation was subtle, almost imperceptible, until it was too late. Psychologists noted that crimes born of escalation are rarely impulsive in the conventional sense. They are meticulously orchestrated, driven by the emotional logic of the perpetrator. Forensic psychologists offered a unifying lens. We often ask ourselves, how did this become possible? In cases like this, it is never one factor. Trauma, relational stress, control, and perceived threat combined. Over time, these emotional pressures build until the perpetrator perceives violence as the only way to regain stability. This analysis reframed the tragedy. It was not just a crime of opportunity. It was the predictable outcome of an emotional storm, unchecked and internalized, manifesting in the most irreversible way. Understanding the psychological landscape does not excuse the crime. It illuminates the forces, pressures, and emotional currents that culminated in tragedy. It reveals that beneath the calm suburban surface, a storm was quietly gathering, a storm that would leave a life destroyed, a community shaken, and a family irrevocably changed. Clint Bonnell was more than a student or a husband. He was a Green Beret, a member of an elite brotherhood forged under pressure, in environments few could endure. Fellow soldiers recalled his unwavering discipline, his calm under stress, and his instinct to protect others. Stories emerged of Clint mentoring younger soldiers, staying behind to ensure everyone completed training, and quietly supporting his peers during deployments. In reunions and social media posts, veterans described a man who carried both strength and humility. To us, Clint was steady, dependable, one former Green Beret said. He never asked for praise. He just did what needed to be done. Even as the tragedy unfolded, the military community honored his commitment, both to service and to the values he carried beyond the battlefield. In his pursuit of a career in medicine, Clint applied the same dedication he had shown in the military. Classmates remembered long nights studying, meticulously reviewing patient cases, and volunteering in labs. Quiet mentorship of peers struggling with coursework. Calm composure under pressure, a stark contrast to the chaos many felt in the competitive PA program. Clint wasn't the loudest or the flashiest, a fellow student said, but he was the one who always had your back. You knew you could count on him. Even in academic environments, Clint's legacy of discipline, precision, and compassion left an indelible mark. For Clint's family, remembering him meant confronting both grief and pride. Parents and siblings shared childhood memories, a boy curious, disciplined, and protective of those around him. Stories highlighted his early love for service, adventure, and helping others. Despite the tragic ending, the family spoke of hope, of Clint's plans to build a new life, and of his unwavering kindness. They don't define him by the way he died, one family member said. They remember the man he was, and the life he dreamed of living. In those reflections, Clint's humanity was restored. Not as a victim but as a man of purpose, love, and dedication. Clint's dream was simple yet profound, to serve others in a different capacity. His PA program represented more than a career. It symbolized healing, continuity, and the pursuit of a meaningful second chapter. He envisioned working with patients in critical care, offering stability, knowledge, and compassion. Friends and classmates remembered him discussing cases with care, eager to make a difference and committed to improving lives. Even after his death, his medical ambitions became a symbol of hope, a reminder of the life he sought to build, disciplined, compassionate, and dedicated to helping others. Clint Bonnell represented more than a military hero or aspiring physician. He embodied reliability in friendship and mentorship, courage in both professional and personal life, compassion for those in need, quiet resilience through transitions and stress. He was the kind of person who quietly inspired others, a friend said. You didn't need him to say it, you just felt it. His story, though ending in tragedy, serves as a reminder of the human potential to lead, care, and impact others profoundly. In the midst of investigation, trial, and media scrutiny, it is easy for Clint Bonnell's story to become numbers, charges, and forensic details. But true crime, when told responsibly, can honor the person behind the tragedy. Clint's life, ambitions, and humanity must remain central. Remembering the choices he made, the lives he touched, and the integrity he carried restores the narrative to a deeply human level. In honoring Clint, the community, classmates, and family remind us that his legacy is not defined by the circumstances of death, but by the life he led and the people he inspired along the way. Clint Bonnell's story is one of service, dedication, and humanity. It is a reminder that even in the shadow of tragedy, the legacy of a life lived with purpose, courage, and compassion endures, and continues to inspire those left behind. As the trial concluded and the community began the slow process of healing, one truth remained undeniable. Behind the headlines, forensic evidence, and courtroom drama, there was a man whose life embodied courage, dedication, and humanity. Clint Bonnell's story is a stark reminder of the cost of hidden turmoil. Conflicts that simmer beneath the surface, emotional struggles left unspoken, and private fears left unresolved can escalate in ways no one anticipates. It is easy to look at a tragedy like this and focus only on the crime itself, the details of a methodical act, the investigation, and the arrest. But doing so risks forgetting the person at the center. Clint was not just a statistic, not just a case file, not just a victim. He was a son, a brother, a friend, a Green Beret, a student, and a man with dreams he had worked tirelessly to achieve. The tragedy also underscores the importance of awareness and compassion. Emotional strain, mental health struggles, and relational conflict are realities that touch lives quietly and invisibly. Communities, families, and friends are called to recognize signs of distress, support those in need, and address conflicts before they spiral beyond repair. In reflecting on Clint's life, we remember the dedication he brought to every role he undertook. His commitment to service in the military, his pursuit of excellence in medical studies, and the care and loyalty he extended to those around him. His story reminds us to honor not only the life lost but the values, integrity, and humanity that defined it. If you want to help share Clint's story, honor his legacy, and bring awareness to the unseen struggles that can escalate into tragedy, you can make a difference simply by spreading the word. Please like, subscribe, and share this video. Every view helps keep his story alive. Your engagement does more than support a channel. It amplifies awareness, encourages conversations about emotional well-being, and reminds us all that even small actions of compassion can matter in profound ways. Tell us in the comments, what stood out most to you in Clint's story? His courage, his dedication, or the warning signs that went unnoticed? By remembering Clint Bonnell for the man he was, not solely for the tragedy that ended his life, we restore his humanity in the narrative. We allow his legacy to inspire, teach, and serve as a reminder that awareness, care, and compassion are essential in every community. Clint Bonnell's story is not merely one of loss. It is a story of service, ambition, courage, and humanity. It is a call to notice what lies beneath the surface, to care for those around us, and to honor lives lived with purpose, even when tragedy cuts them short. Let this narrative serve as both a tribute and a lesson, a reminder that every life holds depth, every struggle deserves attention, and every legacy matters.